All right, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. As a few more folks come into the webinar, welcome. Uh, we are very happy today to be talking about the work that's been going on for 18 plus months on incorporating feedback and suggestions and revisions into the Transparency and Openness Promotion Guidelines. Uh, Shorthand for the purposes of the webinar, we'll probably revert to just calling it TOP 2025 for the time being. And the start of the new year, it'll just be TOP. But I'd like to introduce all of our speakers and the main folks who have been working on this in a very dedicated manner in the recent and past, and who will be presenting today. First, let me say that Sean Grant from the University of Oregon has been a tremendous chair to the advisory board for the TOP guidelines and has really been instrumental in shepherding this process through. Katie Corker, now at ASAP Bio, the executive director at ASAP Bio, has been working with us for the past 2 years and has recently been nominated and voted in to become a member of the TOP Guidelines Advisory Board as one of our newest members. Welcome, Katie. And last but not least, Suzanne Stewart from the University of Chester. Suzanne has been co-chair for the past year and is assuming the mantle of chair of the TOP Guidelines Advisory Board. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for your work so far. Thank you for all the work that you're still going to be doing. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and pass it off to Sean to give an overview of the process and the content of TOP 2025. So let me stop sharing.
David, can you see the slides?
Those look good. Yep.
All right, perfect. Well, David, thank you so much for the kind introduction, and also many, many thanks to David as Director of Policy Initiatives at COS for helping to bring this group together and to also help shepherd this process to the first update to the TOP guidelines since its creation in 2015. So really delighted to be here. Thank you all so much for your time here today. And I am going to give a quick overview, as David said, introducing TOP 2025, our updated guidelines for promoting the verifiability of published empirical research claims. There's a preprint on meta-archive as well. So we're keen both today and if you've read the preprint for your feedback before we submit for peer review. So please do participate in the Q&A and discussion that's going to follow the presentation. So quickly, for those who might not be familiar or who need a refresh on the TOP guidelines, what we're now calling TOP 2015, the original TOP guidelines, they were developed as a policy framework to enhance the verifiability of empirical research claims and journal articles. And namely, TOP 2015 is a set of journal policies that are organized around modular standards for research transparency and reproducibility. And then each of these standards had 3 levels of implementation, each of which are increasing stringency for the journal implementing those policies. And the shorthand that was used in TOP 2015 was that level 1 essentially involved disclosure of whether or not the final research output is shared, whether that practice, that open research practice occurred. The second was a requirement of authors to conduct that practice if possible. And then the third was verification that the practice was done well. And using TOP 2015, the idea was for journals to select which of these standards they wish to implement, which were relevant to studies in their journal. And then for each of those standards, the level of implementation for each. So a given journal could select which of these 8 standards, and then for each standard, set varying levels of implementation as they saw fit for their context. And the goal was for this modular nature of TOP 2015 to enable cross-disciplinary adoption, in part by respecting the unique nature of studies and research across different fields and disciplines. And I think to that end, since its publication, TOP 2015 has been widely endorsed by journals and adapted for use by other organizations in the scholarly community, including preprint platforms, publishers, funders, research institutions, and even individual researchers or research labs. But despite this uptake, there were some issues that were raised over the last 10 years or so about aspects of Top 2015, both its framework and its implementation. And for those of you who might have read it recently, at the end, the top advisory board at that time said we are dedicated to continuous quality improvement. And so over the last 2 years, we started to identify through published research and public forums specific needs or suggestions for an update to top. And I think there are many, but two of the higher order ones that really motivated the changes that we've made for Top 2025 are first that Top 2015 lacked an explicit conceptual framework, which might have led to questions and differing interpretations about the goal of Top and its scope. And maybe part of that is compared to 2015, now 2024 going on to 2025, the open science movement has really taken off, and it's a very wide umbrella. There are a lot of things that fit under the banner of promoting transparency and openness. And so naturally, folks were interested in proposing things under this wider banner. So some things that were raised about the framework were concerns about the appropriateness of TOP to specific methods, both TOP in its totality as well as specific practices within TOP. Then there were also requests from external stakeholders to consider the incorporation of different practices like open publishing and inclusive science practices. So examples of these would be things like open peer review, post-publication peer review, open access publishing, open source publishing, contributor statements, plain language summaries, and reflexivity or positionality statements. And these practices address other vital goals of the open science movement. The board at the moment felt that they fall outside the primary focus of Top 2025 on verifying empirical research claims. And although outside the scope, members of TOP who are active in the wider open science movement are keen to collaborate with groups and organizations interested in advancing these open science efforts. So to give an example personally, in my field of prevention science, I proposed and helped develop the roles and responsibilities of a new health equity associate editor at the journal Prevention Science that was based on my role as methodological transparency editor at another journal. So we used the type of role for research and transparent and reproducible practices at one journal to inspire the creation of a role at a journal that's focused on open science as inclusive science. And so folks are here who are interested in those other aspects of the open science movement and are keen to collaborate with folks on the board. Please do raise that today, or please do get in touch with us. We genuinely do want to collaborate on other aspects of transparency beyond the verifiability of claims. Regarding implementation of Top 2015 defined, as I mentioned earlier, 3 levels of implementation with increasing stringency, but the nature of each level differed across standards. So consequently, those terms, that shorthand of describing the 3 levels as disclose, require, and verify, did not apply consistently across the standards, as you can see here in the red and yellow highlighted squares. And then in addition, implementation of standards reflected either discrete open research practices like data sharing or code sharing, combinations of those open research practices like computational reproducibility, or specific types of studies and specific publication formats like replication studies submitted as registered reports in that bottom orange row. So consequently, some standards were dependent on each other at the most stringent levels of implementation. So for instance, the process of verification for level 3 of Top 2015 required computational reproducibility for data, materials, and code, but that can't be achieved independently because each of those things are needed to reproduce the analyses reported in an article. So this almost served as a block that you got all or none of credit on, rather than giving credit if someone were able to share their code but not their data. And likely in part as a result of the above, efforts to classify journal policies according to Top 2015 have often found poor reliability for some of the standards overall, or some standards at higher levels of implementation that might indicate editors and others have found Top 2015 difficult to interpret and apply in some contexts for some standards and some levels of implementation. And so in response to these and other issues, the Top Guidelines Advisory Board held several virtual meetings between 2022 and 2024 to discuss that external stakeholder feedback that we received and relevant meta research published since 2020, since Top 2015. And after these meetings, a working group of the advisory board drafted a revision to Top 2015 and circulated that draft for discussion and refinement. We have pre-printed that version approved by the board, Top 2025. That is our proposed resultant update of the guidelines. And again, that's available for public comment if you would like to read it or if you have read it and have some feedback for us. And so moving on to what is new in Top 2025, the first thing that we've decided to do is provide that explicit conceptual framework to clarify the primary objective of the top guidelines, which is the verifiability of empirical research claims. There are other important goals within the open science movement, and many of these research practices facilitate other important goals besides increasing the verifiability of empirical research claims, but to help folks understand decisions about what is in and what is out of the top guidelines and what it's primarily intended to do. This framework hopefully clarifies that primary objective and then the logic of what is contained within the entire framework. And then we also reorganized Top 2015 into 3 distinct categories of standards to resolve issues like the interdependency of standards at more stringent levels of implementation in Top 2015, like that example of computational reproducibility from earlier. So there's first research practices that result in discrete open research outputs that increase the transparency of empirical research studies. These open research practices then enable verification practices of evaluating the comprehensiveness of reporting, and particularly the selective non-reporting of results or analyses within a study, and checking the computational reproducibility of reported results. And then these open research and verification practices further enable verification studies that offer specific empirical research designs and publication formats that are focused on verifiability. And then in their totality, when fully and appropriately implemented, these practices and studies can help increase the verifiability of an empirical research claim. Taking each of those in turn, Top 2025 has 7 research practices: study registration, study protocols, analysis plans, and materials data, code, and reporting transparency. To flag what's changed from 2015 from those who are familiar with it, the previous citation standard has been integrated into level 2 for all research practices. So that citation of a shared research output serves as the warrant for the claim that something has been shared publicly. The design and analysis transparency standard in Top 2015 has been relabeled reporting transparency to clarify better the purpose and implementation of this standard through the use of reporting guidelines. And then the previous standards on pre-registration of studies and analysis plans have been revised to align with established definitions of study registration, study protocols, and analysis plans. So rather than a single discrete practice, the term pre-registration described a combination of discrete practices: registering studies, prospectively sharing study protocols, prospectively sharing analysis plans, with pre implying that practices must be performed before some specific event, like recruiting participants for the study. So we've, in Top 2025, disambiguated that label of pre-registration, which is a combination of practices, by focusing on the discrete practices within pre-registration and introducing requirements for disclosing the timing of those practices. So study registration involves entering a time-stamped publicly available record about a study in a register that assigns a unique and permanent study identifier, while study protocols and analysis plans provide more comprehensive information about planned methods and analyses, respectively, and they may be in the same document or different documents, shared as preprints or journal articles, and/or included prospectively in study registrations. These 3 research practices have 3 levels of implementation with increasing stringency, like in Top 2015, but we've revised them so that they follow that same logical structure for each research practice to ensure consistency in defining them as disclose, share and cited, and certified. So for level 1, authors are required to disclose whether or not the research output is shared and its location if so. For level 2, the research output must be shared and cited to the extent that it is applicable and ethical for a given study. And for level 3, a party independent from the authors must certify that that research practice was shared according to best practice. And now an organization can create tailored policies by study type according to current best practice. So a journal may, for example, require certification that clinical trials specifically are registered and their study protocols and analysis plans shared according to best practice, but they may have different levels of implementation for those standards for other study types. Two verification practices, comprehensive reporting and computational reproducibility, are each enabled by a combination of two or more of the 7 open research practices. Completeness of reporting involves comparing reports of results that follow reporting guidelines with research outputs created before the studies were conducted, like the study registration, study protocols, and/or analysis plans. Computational reproducibility involves an independent party using materials, data, and code to reproduce the results associated with empirical research claims. And again, in Top 2015, this verification practice was level 3 for materials, data, and code transparency. In Top 2025, we've separated the assessment of computational reproducibility, which is a practice to verify a result, from assessment of constituent research practices. So now level 3 for materials, data, and code means that each one of those things was or was not individually shared according to best practice, like fair data, for example. And then lastly, while research and verification practices might apply to any study making an empirical claim, verification studies offer specific empirical research designs and publication formats that focus on verifiability. As with Top 2015, we've retained but pulled out the replication standard. And we've also pulled out registered report from being just level 3 for replication as its own verification study. In Top 2015, replication was the only standard for a specific study design and the only standard that had a specific publication format. Registered reports is level 3. And we wanted to create a dedicated section for verification studies that helps resolve these inconsistent levels of implementation. And as with Top 2015, continue to promote recognition of the value of these studies that aim to independently verify empirical results or offer opportunities for self-correction to more efficiently identify promising research directions. In addition, there are 2 verification study types that have gained prominence since Top 2015. The first are multiverse studies that test the research question of interest across different analytic data sets that arise from different yet reasonable and justified choices for processing and analyzing the same underlying raw data set. And then many analyst studies involve independent analysis teams that conduct plausible alternative analyses of a research question on the same data set. We're not saying that these are the only 4, but these were the 4 that the advisory board agreed to include for now. If there are additional verification studies that folks would like to propose, please raise them or reach out. So to end, before we go to the Q&A, we do want to note that as with Top 2015, Top 2025 does have still a primary or at least a very tailored focus on journal policies, or it's still very applicable to journal adoption. So journals can implement policies on research and verification practices into their instructions to authors, editors, and reviewers, and they can list verification studies in their instructions to authors as dedicated article submission options. But absent from Top 2015, we also encourage journals to consider how these policies are implemented in submission systems and article production so that there's coherence across the entire journal workflow. So for example, with the support of their publishers, journals can also incorporate disclosures about research and verification practices into their manuscript submission systems and article templates. And for journals that implement standards for research practices at higher levels, these can be integrated into editorial standards and procedures and guidance for peer reviewers. That said, with the revision of the wording of standards to be more author and study-centric in Top 2025, we think it can also be more useful to other organizations in the scholarly community. Preprint servers have come a long way since 2015, and they can also implement policies and procedures on research and verification practices in a manner similar to journals based on the types of studies submitted and the resources of the preprint organization. Funders could use Top 2025 to inform grant requirements on research and verification practices for applicable study designs and can create dedicated funding for verification studies of existing empirical research. Academic departments, schools, universities, and other institutions that employ researchers could use Top 2025 to facilitate informed decision making about standards for hiring, promotion, and tenure related to transparent and reproducible research. And these institutions and other departments within those institutions, like universities and libraries that educate research students and offer research training, could use Top 2025 to help design curricula around transparent and reproducible research. And then another example, organizations that curate research evidence. In my field, they're known as clearinghouses of evidence-based interventions, could use Top 2025 to update the criteria by which they classify and assess empirical research claims, like whether an intervention is evidence-based or the strength of the evidence underlying an intervention. We hope that with one unified framework, coordinated implementation of TOP across institutions is more likely to facilitate the research enterprise to be transparent and reproducible by design. So, some things that might be worth discussing today. These are comments that we've seen about TOP, both 2015 and 2025, or feedback that we've received in our public comment form. I think three main ones that I thought would be important to mention today are as one, that verifiability is one of many important issues, and TOP standards are not the only way to address it. So, we would agree with folks who say that this, we would for folks who think that this implies that verifiability is the only issue we need to focus on to improve science, we would agree that there are many things that need to be done. The importance of research questions, the appropriateness of methods for answering those questions, effective execution of studies, so study quality. Those are all important things amongst many others. We just naturally do think that it is an important thing to focus on, that verifiability is one of the things that should have a focus in meta science and research reform. We also acknowledge that there are other things needed beyond the standards in TOP. So methodological and statistical approaches are also important, amongst other things. We naturally, again, think that it is also helpful to have a framework that specifically focuses on open practices in research life cycles and workflows and verification practices and studies. There was a gap for that. TOP tries to fill that gap. Secondly, the goal of TOP, as it was in TOP 2015, is informed decision making that is appropriate for context, not universal mandates for level 3 for everything without exception. The goal of defining categories of standards within research practices or standards within categories and levels within research practices is to facilitate informed decision making by journals or other organizations. They can set policy levels based off of the appropriateness or relevance or applicability for specific studies, for their organizational capacity to implement at more stringent levels, for disciplinary norms and expectations. And we hope moving forward, data from meta research and continuous quality improvement that might guide how they set policies fit for their context. And this policy setting can be adopting new standards at higher levels, or it can be de-implementing levels or entire standards as views evolve and evidence accumulates. The goal is informed decision making. This is a conceptual framework to help folks make sense of these different practices and studies and what they are primarily trying to achieve. And then lastly, we've received some comments about implications of the update or questions about implications of the update for open science badges and top factor. Open science badges and top factor are related but distinct initiatives from the top guidelines. They're certainly informed by the top guidelines, but they're independently operated by the Center for Open Science. They're not things that the advisory board is formally involved in. And so that's something that we can chat about or direct questions to COS. But we thought that that was an important thing to clarify based off of some of the comments and questions we received. So with that, we thank you so much again for being here today and for your interest in this. And we really look forward to the conversations and questions you have. David, back to you.
Sean, thanks for that great overview. There's a lot to unpack there. We're going to open it up for questions. So we've got some questions coming in through the Q&A window and through the chat. I'm going to take the prerogative as the host to get us started and get the ball rolling. And then we'll make sure to get through all the questions that we have time for, of course. I think we'll have a meaty discussion. Some of those will be directed to me. I'm happy to talk about badges and top factor. Some of those are going to be directed to you all. about the process we've gone through, some implications in the future. Um, Suzanne, I'm going to start off with a question to you, if that's okay.
Yeah.
As the upcoming, as the chair-elect, the chairperson for 2025, I wanted to kind of ask a question about the current scope of TOP that Sean outlined beautifully, and that is uh, items that address or ideally improve the verifiability of empirical claims as the scope of the top guidelines, and talk a little bit about things that we thought fell outside that, or your thoughts about what it would take to either change the scope or to look differently at the scope of the top guidelines in the future to include things such as open peer review or open access publishing or disclosure of conflicts of interest and those types of things. Do you have thoughts about those?
Well, I think what is very helpful about the top 2025 is the fact that, as Sean explained, it explicitly defines the underlying logic model. And so, of course, the framework is derived from that logic model and is focused on the verifiability of claims. So I think going forward, if there was dialogue with the scholarly community in terms of that continuous quality improvement process that we want to continue engaging in with the community, if there was scope to expand the focus of TOP beyond verifiability, then there may then be scope to bring in some of these other very important practices and way of improving research and science. But I think it's important to acknowledge that this has to be this continuous dialogue between the advisory board and the community to engage in that and ensure that the guidelines meet that focus, can expand the focus reasonably, and that it serves the needs of the community.
Oh, awesome. Yeah, thanks. I think that would be a lot of dialogue to address what those are currently and what they should be in the future. I'm going to answer a question that's come in through the Q&A box. And I'm going to add to it also a point that Sean made in the last slide or two. So Rebecca asks, is the intention still to score journals against top? And she's referring to top factor in that case. If so, is this a self-assessment or who will be assessed? I'm also going to add a little aside about the badging program also. But Rebecca, the intention is not to use top factor going forward from 2025 and beyond. So it's not going to be an initiative that we are focusing on or that we will be conducting further. It's possible that in the future we'll use the top framework to assess practices that are making their way out into the published literature, and again use those research practices that Top 2025 identifies as indicators of open science adoption across different disciplines or publishers or other entities. But scoring author guideline policies against the top guidelines is not something we're going to do with Top 2025 and beyond. And the intention with the badging program is to complement the framework that the top guidelines applies. So the definitions that are included in the research practices will accurately reflect the criteria used in the existing badging program, and where there are current, where they don't sync up currently, minor revisions will be made to make sure that protocol availability is an option that journals could use. Currently, the pre-registered badge or the pre-registered plus analysis plan badge, those are going to be revised given the distinction that Top 2025 has made between those practices. So there'll be minor revisions to that, but that will take their inspiration, or that will take their lead from Top 2025. Okay. A couple of other questions. I'm not sure which panelist wants to take that. Katie, if it's okay with you, I might put you on the spot to pick your brain about this one. But it's one of the our attendees ask, what role will funding agencies have for assessing top protocols for grantees in terms of assessment and/or funding? What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I mean, there's a lot of things that funders can do with respect to top. So, I mean, the obvious low-hanging fruit is that, funders can use top to structure the requirements of their grantees, so they can, in essence, set their own top levels for what they expect their grantees to do. So they could say, for example, that they would like to see level 2 implementation of the research practices in the research that they fund, meaning that grantees would be required to share and cite their data, materials, code, protocols, registrations. Beyond that, though, I think funders can use TOP as a framework to evaluate potential grantees, so they can look backwards at researchers' past behavior to see to what extent researchers have been already implementing these practices among their research, and they can use that as a potential qualification for evaluating the quality of a potential grantee, or the potential trustworthiness of previous research of a grantee. Another thing that I think funders can do, and also institutions as well, is they can provide specific and dedicated support. So giving opportunities for training and other kinds of professional development that help grantees and researchers more generally become proficient in these various practices is an area that they could definitely be doing more. So providing either grants to enable others to provide trainings, or offering those trainings themselves.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think there are a lot of different options for each entity to consider adopting or consider using from this. Sean, I'm going to pass it back to you. I'm going to combine two questions that came in on similar themes about the highest levels here.
Sure.
So I'm going to paraphrase two questions, and I hope to do justice to both of them. But essentially, it comes down to the highest level certification is expensive in terms of the number of hours it would take to do that. Who is expected to do that? What would the outputs of that process look like? Who would get credit for it? What do we, or you, envision as the process for that highest level? And just to seed your answer a little bit, also, I'll also mention some current examples of, especially the American Economics Association, who does dedicate time and staff effort to some of these higher level types of practices for rerunning data and code prior to publication. But Sean, now that I've answered some of your question, I'm going to let you answer some more.
No, yeah, thanks for the great question. And David, I gave one example there to the answer that I think it could really vary and should vary depending on discipline, on study type, on resources available. I think the bottom line is that the verification happens by someone not on the author team, so that there is that independent verification that something was registered, a study protocol was shared and developed, code or data were shared according to best practice. That could be members of the journal editorial staff, particularly if they're dedicated editors for methodological transparency. AEA's data editor is a great example of that, and their team. Could be peer reviewers. There are organizations that are starting to arise that provide that service. Institutions are starting to look into being able to provide that service either within a college or department level or campus wide, particularly through library services. Talk to your librarians if you have any institution, they're always the best. I think it could vary, and I think there's work to be done on thinking through who can do that, delineating folks, competencies that we want to develop in the ecosystem so that more of those folks continue to exist. As Katie's saying, having funders pay for their time, let's pay specialists properly and adjust budget regulations and constraints and funding mechanisms to accommodate that rather than having folks having to fit that in with existing constraints. I think there's a lot of exciting work to be done there, but I think it can and should vary, and could be a reason why a journal doesn't go level 3 if they don't have the resources or the person available to do that work yet. So I'd love to chat more about folks who want to make that more possible. I think
Yeah,
I saw Katie come off mute.
Yeah, just to
Yeah.
add to what you're saying, or kind of connect it back to what I was just saying before about things that funders can do. This is another sort of obvious gap for, funders to provide this as a service for their grantees. And I think I could imagine this happening most likely to happen within, say, really specialist communities. Like there's some funding agencies that fund Alzheimer's research that are doing a really good job of being at the forefront of a lot of open science practices, like the Michael J. Fox Foundation, for example, is one of them. I could very easily imagine that, the stakes are high for them, right? They really want to know that the research that they're funding is of a particular level of quality. And so having the funder provide that as a service to grantees is, in the service of enhancing, what the funder is going for with their grants.
Good call out there.
Might just jump in as well, just as another example of this, the University of Sussex in the UK. So I think about a couple of years now, the School of Psychology has had an internal reproducibility check. So they have an expert in reproducibility who kind of runs the code for other researchers, and then the research team receives a kind of a certificate of reproducibility that they can submit along with their manuscript to the journal that they're targeting.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a good example of a real value add that the service provides to the research community. Katie, I'm going to ask you a question that came in from Robert. Great to see how you've distinguished verifiability from other issues such as, quote, better, more rigorous, impactful, or higher quality. Do you have a theory or other type of model for how increasing verifiability will impact these other issues? Or if everything's verifiable, what can we expect to happen, do you think?
Yeah, this is a great question. I see two potential ways that increasing verifiability could increase research quality. One of them relies on increasing scrutiny and sort of a culture of critique among scientists. So if information is made transparent, then potentially nothing happens with that information. And in the worst case scenario, it just sits there, and I guess we've wasted some time and resources sharing it. But in an ideal scenario, in the best case scenario, other researchers within the community are actively critiquing and participating with that information that's been shared and using it to inform both their own reuse of that material, but also being able to understand something more about the quality of that information than you can. Right now, research is a bit of a black box, so we don't necessarily know what's gone into the claims that researchers are making. So by having that transparency, there's an opportunity for critique that's there that would not be there without that transparency. The second mechanism for change is that through the process of doing this documentation and providing that additional information, researchers are adding in quality checks to their own research process that would not have been there otherwise. So by making it so that they have to communicate more and share more, make more transparent information about the study, there's information that's revealed there that would not otherwise have been revealed, and it's the quality of the research is being enhanced through the process of sharing. There's probably other mechanisms, but those are two that I see.
Well, one thing that, Katie, this last comment you made, and then from the last question that I wanted to add to, because I thought they were great, this concept of how higher the stakes also potentially being an influence of requirements. So in areas that I work in, where again, it's doing systematic reviews or evidence syntheses of evaluations of interventions to designate them as evidence-based or not. And those designations can influence millions, if not in totality, billions of publicly allocated funds. That's very instrumental use for very influential decisions that might say, if we are concerned enough about how verifiable these results are, should we consider implementing some of these things at higher standards? In those areas, there are explicit conceptual frameworks like the GRADE approach, for example, that take into consideration not just verifiability as something that you use to assess the evidence, but the quality of the studies and how, in that context, for example, they support causal inferences, the heterogeneity or consistency of results across studies, how precise or imprecise estimates are, how direct is the evidence that you have to the context you want to apply it. And I think just promoting awareness and understanding of those wider frameworks within which verifiability sits would also be really important, in part to address these questions about it's not just verifiability, right? There are other things we need to do. So I think there's a lot to be learned from the high stakes areas where this is used, and then thinking through which of those things can we adopt, adapt, or maybe discard in lower stakes or different contexts. Happy to chat with folks who are keen on that nerdy issue too.
Question came in for me from Kelly. If top factor will no longer be used, how can journals acknowledge that these guidelines have been followed in the creation of their policies, or to demonstrate how well the journal does in terms of these principles? Thank you, Kelly. That's a good question. And let me give a little bit of background about sort of behind the decision to no longer publicize assessments of journal policies and what we would like to focus on more specifically. And the basic fact was that it was a couple of steps removed from the outcomes we really wanted to see. So speaking on behalf of the Center for Open Science, our mission is to increase transparency and reproducibility of science, and something that's very close to that is the number of openly available research outputs that are attached to empirical research claims. So can you even start to replicate a published empirical claim by seeing the underlying protocol or methods or data or code and those types of practices? A means to do that is through well-written author guidelines that specifically tell authors what to do. But there are other means to do that. We ran into a lot of, we've assessed over 3,200 author guidelines and journal policies, and a lot of them are extraordinarily poorly written. A lot of them are self-contradictory. A lot of them imply one thing or another, and the vast majority of them aren't read by anyone. And so spending our time doing that was, we determined, not the best use of time. And so focusing more on, and what journals should be focusing more on, is the various ways to actually see those types of outputs associated with empirical claims. And so what journals can and should do is use the top guidelines framework as a framework, as a goalpost to reach towards. So these are the things that this group of experts thinks is important for increasing the verifiability of work that they're publishing, and to do what they think is best to reach those goals of increasing those types of research outputs. That could be through increased recognition, through making it easy to see which papers have those outputs available. It could be through very well-enforced journal policies. It could be through editorials describing the types of practices that the editors want to see as they come out. It could be through the article submission process, specifying where is your data, where is your code, where is your protocol. Those are all reasonable avenues to increasing these types of practices. And the things that we do want to care about is what are the outputs that end up getting shared from those variety of practices. So we'll be spending our time supporting journals that are working towards that aim, working towards that goal. And if they want to do that through well-written policies or increased recognition or through better article submission workflows, those are the areas that we want to spend our time consulting with and partnering with journals, promoting those outcomes.
David, can I offer an example from a journal where I am the methods transparency editor and see if it matches the way that COS is thinking going forward? So it's the methods transparency editor for the Journal of Research and Educational Effectiveness, or DRE. And my role there is to think through the policies related to research transparency and verifiability, make decisions in conjunction and collaboration with the editorial board and with approval from the society board, and then think through how to implement those in the submission system and the journal article templates. So with this update, I would still see it being useful in our section on the top guidelines and the instructions for authors as a communication tool to say we are still level 1 for the 7 research practices, asking folks to disclose whether or not there is a study registration, a publicly available protocol, analysis plan, data, code, etc. To have a discussion about adding the different verification studies that will be in top 2025 to studies that are welcome at the journal. Right now, we welcome replications. We're experimenting with adding registered reports, but would need to talk to the board about the other two. And then we're starting to explore verification practices of reproducibility and reporting checks, not as a requirement for publication, but something that we do after acceptance to identify the degree to which something was reproducible or comprehensively reported as a first step, maybe towards requiring that down the line, based on how that pilot goes. And then in the submission system, having a dedicated form asking folks to answer questions about whether or not things were shared, and if so, where they're located, and then having a process to make sure that there are sections in the article template where those things are disclosed. And I am part of the pre-production process to make sure that information makes it to the typesetters. So while, if I'm understanding correctly, there may no longer be a living database of up-to-date scores of journals using top factor and how they operationalize the guidelines, I, in this role at the journal, would still, in the instructions to authors, communicate what level we're at so that it helps understand authors and peer reviewers and the handling editors understand expectations of them, and then use the guidelines to inform their implementation through the rest of our manuscript handling and publication process. Does that still fit with how COS sees this, David? Anything to add to that?
No, I think that fits a lot. And what I keep sort of coming back to, kind of the importance of level 1 being, it takes a lot of work to institutionalize or to build out forms or to build out expectations for everybody, from author to handling editor to typesetter to peer reviewers. Everybody's sort of starting to expect and look for these types of things, and getting better, more consistent, standardized practice or workflows, essentially, of where do I look for these 7 things? Should I be looking for the seven things? What should I do once I see one of these 7 things, or once I see an absence of them? Those are all types of I think, long work that's needed to improve all of our experiences and expectations. Then it comes to enforcing norms, and then it comes to funding people to take the time to computationally reproduce that. All of that is enabled by especially that consistent level 1 approach. And one of our R&D projects at COS is a project coming out next year called the Life Cycle Journal. And the aim of that is to really push the boundary on how much you can really push on all of these and more types of practices in order to get the best possible output. But even that is starting with a level 1 approach of just how can we consistently collect this information so that all the assessment services that we're partnering with can actually get to and do what they do best for verifying whatever they want to verify or are able to verify.
Yeah, I think there's actually probably an important sort of missing piece of social infrastructure here, which is that there's not a consistent way of requiring these kinds of disclosures, to my knowledge anyways. There's journals or disciplines where sort of the norm is to have a separate data availability statement. The data availability statement can include lots of different things, not just data. But my sense is that the norms vary wildly in terms of where is that statement placed, how is that information collected, what do you do with it, and from a sort of metadata perspective, it seems like it would be a useful contribution. There's two useful contributions I could see. One is sort of a meta science project that would just do sort of scoping review to understand the different variability in the way that these things are currently implemented, and then a second stage to maybe attempt to standardize or provide some better practices in terms of consistency across different outlets. Because I do think one of the things I've seen working with different journals and publishers and so on is that authors are presented with a very confusing array of different options, and having that consistency helps them better understand what the expectations are and better comply. So it's one thing to just say that we can improve the author guidelines. Like, yes, we certainly can, but authors are in some ways conditioned to just ignore the guidelines because they're so capricious and variable and, out of date sometimes.
Well, I spent a little time a few years ago looking at all of the author guidelines, not just those that had anything to do with items that showed up in the top guidelines, and just did some fun visualizations of how much of the author guidelines had something to do with the science that's being submitted and how much of it had to do with things such as typesetting. And it was a vast ratio of most of it was in the red in terms of not relevant to the science and talking about lots of minutiae that are difficult to read through. All right, there are two questions that I think we'll take a little time to answer, and there are a couple of issues that they're pointing out. The first one is essentially talking to I think one of the biggest challenges of our time around misinformation. But do we foresee a role of top in media and health communication? I would just say in almost any scientific discipline with regards to misinformation. This is a tough one to answer. The best that we're not going to answer it in a 5-minute webinar at the end of a webinar, but one of the motivating factors for a lot of our work is that responding to misinformation with opaque practices is not the right way to go. It's the way forward through transparency. It is necessary, but we know that might not be sufficient, and so it's in the step in the right direction to addressing misinformation, but it enables a lot more difficult conversations as well. So I don't know if anybody else wants to chime in with their opinion about TOP being used as a framework for addressing misinformation, but it's a median difficult.
I think maybe not specifically misinformation, but related. I would love for there to be, if possible, David, maybe follow-up webinars or conversations about thinking about unintended negative consequences and harm of these initiatives. And I think weaponization of this for merchants of doubt to gut certain areas is something that would be really important for us as a initiative, for those who work in this space, to continue and increasingly be cognizant of, and finding the Goldilocks problem of how do we promote practices and studies as and when appropriate, but also be mindful of how those might be used in bad faith and mitigate those uses. So I think, as you say, much more than we can handle now at the end of this, but I think it's a great question that speaks to something that I think needs to be a main theme of the discourse and activity in meta science going forward.
Yeah, I'll give a hearty endorsement of that. These are the types of things that keep me up at night, and I think it's worth spending a lot of time considering that problem. The last question coming in is asking about essentially promoting or reinforcing past inequities. So Katie, I'm going to pass this to you because it sort of came up some of the discussion about how funders can use it. And I'll start off with a little bit of an answer also. So if funders look at past performance of undertaking these open science practices, does that reinforce existing inequities? Because a lot of the folks who have been conducting it were the well-resourced individuals who had the training, knowledge, or what have you to be among the first adopters. And what I think kind of about that is that it's a long-term vision that requires a lot of forewarning or discussion about what the expectations will be in the coming future. And given that, what can we resource through training, through examples, through easier to use infrastructure to make sure that that is minimized to the biggest extent possible in the years to come. Katie, do you have anything you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, that's a good answer, a good point. I think certainly, funders or other stakeholders that consider enacting these kinds of policies are usually quite thoughtful about the kinds of support and sort of runway that they give before, changes are rolled out. But I think one thing that I'll say, it's a very tricky problem, is that there are all kinds of inequities in the way that science and research is done. Open science is not likely to solve all of them. We can certainly try to approach problems like this with an equity-focused lens to try to improve equity-related issues as much as we can as we advocate for changes. But expecting one particular type of reform to solve all problems related to research is probably asking too much. So it's certainly there could be equity issues with any kinds of policy outlay like this, but we shouldn't forget that we're already existing under a highly inequitable system that probably these kinds of inequities are already baked into.
Yeah, I think that's a challenging topic, and one that's not easily solvable, but through activities like this for raising awareness and providing both runway and information and resources, the an important goal of at least not making it worse is should be front and center.
I will say one other counterpoint is that it's not always the case that these proposed reforms are resource positive. So sometimes they simply involve rearranging a workflow where you do, some work earlier in the process than you would have done it anyway. And so it's not that there's additional cost, it's just differently placed. So
yeah. And there is cost in starting something new, but a lot of these are workflow improvements that result in increased efficiency, and so that's a good practice to try to institute as early as possible. With that, we are at time. I want to thank Katie, Suzanne, and Sean for lots of things, for your time over the past hour, for your time preparing for this webinar, for the time that you spent in almost countless hours or discussing these topics and the ways to address them. I also want to make sure I thank the entire TOP Guidelines Advisory Board and the people who over the years have been suggesting improvements and revisions and who have so far responded to the request for information on the draft TOP 2025. Thank you, everybody.